For over 4,000 years, the pyramids have stood in silent defiance of time, guarding a secret that modern technology still cannot fully explain. We have sent machines to the surface of distant planets. We have split the atom and mapped the human genome. And yet, standing before the Great Pyramid of Giza, some of the brightest minds of our age fall quiet, unable to say with certainty how a civilization without cranes, without steel, without a single line of what we would call modern engineering, raised more than 2 million blocks of stone into a structure so precise that its base is level to within a few centimeters, and its faces are aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal points of the Earth. Think about that for a moment. A monument older than recorded history, more accurate in some of its measurements than buildings we construct today. And here lies the paradox that has haunted scholars, dreamers, and seekers for centuries. If the ancient Egyptians possessed such extraordinary wisdom, such command over stone and star and number, then why did so much of that knowledge simply vanish from the world? Because it did vanish. The temples fell silent. The priests who once whispered their secrets in torchlit chambers passed into dust. And whatever they truly knew, whatever understanding allowed them to build in a way that still confounds us, seems to have slipped through the fingers of history like sand through an hourglass. We are left with the shells of their genius, the monuments, the carvings, the weathered faces of gods, but the living meaning behind them, the thought that animated it all, feels forever just out of reach. Now, consider a stranger possibility still. When we imagine lost knowledge, we picture burning scrolls and shattered libraries, the flames of Alexandria consuming 1,000,000 pages of forgotten truth. But what if the greatest library ever destroyed was never made of papyrus or stone at all? What if it existed within the minds of living men and women, initiates who carried their teachings not in books but in memory, in ritual, in the deliberate silence of those sworn never to write down what they knew? A library of flesh and breath, of whispered instruction passed from master to student across generations. Such a library cannot be burned, but it can be forgotten. When the last person who understands falls silent, the knowledge does not go up in smoke. It simply ceases to exist, as quietly as a candle guttering out in an empty room. And perhaps that is exactly what happened in Egypt. Perhaps the greatest treasure of the ancient world was never buried in a tomb, but locked inside the human heart, and lost the moment there was no one left to remember. This is the heart of our story. For history remembers Egypt through its monuments, the pyramids rising from the desert, the great Sphinx gazing eternally toward the horizon, the towering columns of Karnak, the golden mask of a boy king. These are the images that fill our museums and our imaginations, and they are magnificent. But what if the monuments were never the point? What if they were merely the outer skin of something far deeper, a vast system of understanding that was never meant to be seen by ordinary eyes, only understood by those prepared to receive it? What if Egypt's true greatness lay not in what it built but in what it knew, and in the extraordinary care it took to protect that knowing from the uninitiated, from the careless, from the passage of time itself? To understand this, we have to change the way we look at ancient Egypt entirely. We tend to see it as a civilization of pharaohs and pyramids, of gold and conquest, a kingdom of power and death. But to those who studied its inner traditions, Egypt was something else. It was a school, a vast, living academy of the soul, where knowledge of the heavens, of geometry, of medicine, of the mysteries of life and death, was gathered, refined, and guarded with almost unimaginable devotion. The Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the practical. To them, the movement of the stars and the flooding of the Nile, the proportions of a temple and the fate of the soul after death, were all threads in a single, seamless fabric of understanding. And at the center of that understanding stood a class of initiates, the keepers of the mystery schools, whose entire existence was devoted to preserving a wisdom they believed was older than Egypt itself. It is here that our journey finds its true guide. In the early 20th century, a scholar named Manly P. Hall attempted something almost impossibly ambitious. He set out to gather the scattered fragments of this forgotten wisdom, the symbols, the myths, the surviving whispers of the ancient traditions, and bind them together into a single monumental work. He called it The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and within its pages, Hall made a claim that still echoes with quiet power. He suggested that ancient Egypt preserved one of humanity's greatest spiritual and philosophical traditions, a hidden system of education that shaped the very foundations of Western thought, and that fragments of this wisdom, though scattered and disguised, may still survive to this day, waiting in plain sight for anyone who knows how to see. And so we are left standing at the edge of a mystery that spans thousands of years, caught between two truths. There is what history remembers, the stone, the gold, the grandeur, and there is what history forgot, the meaning, the method, the sacred inner science of a people who understood the world in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. Somewhere between remembering and forgetting lies the secret of ancient Egypt. But before we can understand what was lost, we must first understand what this hidden knowledge truly was, and why it was concealed. To find the answer, we must return to the very heart of that ancient world, to a time when the desert bloomed with temples and the air itself seemed heavy with sacred purpose. We must walk, if only in imagination, through the towering halls where priests moved like shadows and knowledge was a living flame, guarded and passed from soul to soul. For only by standing once more in the light of Egypt's golden age can we begin to understand what its people truly knew. There is a book that dares to make an extraordinary claim. Written in the early 20th century by a man named Manly P. Hall, it is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages, and within its vast pages it gathers the scattered fragments of humanity's oldest wisdom, and at the very heart of that wisdom, older than almost anything else it describes, stands Egypt. For according to Hall and to countless mystics and philosophers before him, ancient Egypt was not simply a civilization of builders and kings. It was the guardian of one of the greatest spiritual and philosophical traditions the world has ever known. This is the idea we must sit with. Behind the pyramids that pierce the desert sky, behind the temples whose columns rise like petrified forests, behind every carved symbol and painted wall, there existed something more. Not merely decoration, not merely religion as we understand it today, but an entire system of knowledge, a way of seeing the universe and the soul that was taught in silence, protected in shadow, and passed only to those deemed worthy to receive it. The stones we admire were never meant to be the message. They were the vessel. The true teaching lived somewhere deeper, in the minds and hearts of those who had been prepared to understand. And those who guarded this teaching belonged to something the ancient world called the mystery schools. The name itself carries a weight of wonder, and it deserves to be understood carefully. These were not schools in any sense we would recognize. There were no open doors, no public lectures, no texts handed freely to the curious. Instead, the mystery schools were sacred institutions of hidden education, reserved for the initiate alone. To enter was to cross a threshold that could not be uncrossed. The seeker would undergo long years of preparation, of purification, of testing, until at last they were permitted to glimpse truths that the ordinary world was never allowed to see. Knowledge in this world was not a possession to be bought. It was a transformation to be earned. And so the questions begin to gather, like travelers at the edge of a great and unfamiliar country. What exactly were these Egyptian mystery schools? Who were the men and women who dedicated their entire lives to them? And what did they hope to find within those hidden chambers? What knowledge did the initiate seek, kneeling in the darkness of the temple, waiting to be reborn into understanding? Was it knowledge of the stars and their movements, of the geometry that shaped the pyramids, of the invisible forces that governed life and death? Or was it something even more intimate, a knowledge of the self, of the soul, of what it truly means to be a conscious being standing briefly beneath an eternal sky? And there is a question more troubling still. If this wisdom was so great, so profound, so precious to those who held it, then why was it kept secret at all? Why not carve it plainly upon the temple walls for all generations to read? Why hide it behind symbol and riddle, behind trials and vows of silence? Perhaps the answer is that some truths cannot simply be told. Perhaps they must be lived, experienced, suffered for, before they can be understood. Or perhaps the priests knew something we have forgotten, that knowledge placed in unprepared hands becomes not a light but a danger. These are the questions that will follow us through everything that comes next, and each one is a door waiting to be opened. Yet the story does not end at the borders of Egypt. For if the teachings of the Nile were as powerful as this ancient book suggests, then surely they could not remain forever sealed within a single land. And indeed, as we shall see, their influence flowed outward like the great river itself, carrying its wisdom into distant times and distant minds. We will trace how the teachings of Egypt reached into the golden age of Greece, shaping the thought of philosophers who would in turn shape the whole of Western civilization. We will follow the current further still, into the mysterious tradition known as Hermeticism, into the sacred symbolism of the Kabbalah, into the secret rituals of Freemasonry, and into the many esoteric schools that rose and fell across the centuries. Again and again we will find the same fingerprints, the same symbols, the same haunting ideas, as though a single ancient voice were echoing through age after age, refusing to be silenced. And that leads us at last to the deepest question of all, the one this entire journey is truly built to answer. If this wisdom was so ancient, so widespread, so deeply woven into the foundations of our world, then is it possible that fragments of it survive even now? Could the forgotten knowledge of Egypt still exist in our own time, not locked away in some hidden vault, but hidden in plain sight, all around us, waiting patiently for those who know how to recognize its language? Could the symbols on our buildings, our monuments, even the images we pass every day without a second glance, still carry whispers of a science we believed was lost forever? These are the mysteries we will pursue together. The central claim before us is simple and staggering to consider, that ancient Egypt preserved a spiritual and philosophical tradition of astonishing depth, hidden within a system of sacred education that shaped the very soul of civilization. To grasp the weight of this hidden knowledge, we must step back in time and stand within the golden age of Egypt itself. So let us close our eyes for a moment and cross the vast distance of time, past the crumbling ruins and the silent museums, back to an age when the sands of the Nile shimmered with life and purpose. Let us return to a world where the temples were not empty stones but living sanctuaries, humming with chant and incense, where the boundary between the earthly and the divine felt thin enough to touch. Before we can understand what was hidden, we must first witness what once stood in full and radiant glory, and feel, if only for a breath, the wonder of Egypt at the height of its golden age. Imagine now that the mist of centuries has lifted, and you are standing on the sacred ground of Egypt as the world stirs toward dawn. Above you rise the towering columns of Karnak, so vast and so many that they seem less like the work of human hands and more like a forest grown from stone. Each pillar is carved from base to summit with figures of gods and kings, with prayers and processions frozen in the rock, and in the pale blue light before sunrise their painted colors glow softly, as though the walls themselves are breathing. The air is cool and heavy with the scent of incense, and somewhere in the shadows a low chant begins, rising and falling like the pulse of the earth. Priests move in silence between the columns, their white linen robes catching the first faint gleam of morning, their bare feet whispering against the polished floor. They are preparing for a ceremony older than memory, a rite meant to greet the sun as it climbs above the horizon and to welcome the god of light back into the world of the living. Stand here a while and feel the reverence in the air. This is not a place of idle worship but a place of profound intention where every gesture carries meaning and every word is weighed. As the first golden ray breaks across the eastern desert and pours through the great hall, the columns ignite with light, and for a single breathless moment the temple becomes what its builders always meant it to be: a bridge between heaven and earth, a place where the divine descends to meet the human. And you begin to understand that for the Egyptians, architecture was never merely shelter or spectacle. It was theology written in stone, a language of proportion and shadow and light designed to awaken something deep within the soul. Now let your feet carry you southward along the banks of the Nile to the Temple of Luxor. Here the atmosphere shifts and grows more intimate, more secret. Beyond the grand courtyards where ordinary worshippers could gather, there lie inner chambers that few were ever permitted to enter. Only those who had been prepared, the initiates, those who had proven their discipline, their patience, and their purity of heart, could pass beyond these sacred thresholds. Imagine descending into the dim halls of initiation, where the light of torches flickers against walls inscribed with mysteries, where the outside world falls silent, and the seeker is left alone with the deepest questions of existence. These were places of testing and transformation, where a man or woman might enter as one person and emerge, days later, utterly changed. What trials awaited them in that darkness, what visions and revelations we can only imagine, but the walls themselves seem to hold their breath, keeping the secret still. Follow the great river north now, all the way to the shining city of Alexandria, jewel of the ancient world. Here the sea breeze mingles with the desert heat, and the streets teem with lifer merchants and philosophers, astronomers and poets, travelers drawn from every corner of the known world. At the heart of this city stood one of the greatest wonders humanity has ever created, not of stone but of thought, the Library of Alexandria. Imagine walking through its endless halls, past shelf upon shelf of scrolls, hundreds of thousands of them, gathering the accumulated wisdom of Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and lands beyond. Scholars bent over their manuscripts by lamplight, copying and comparing, debating the movements of the stars and the nature of the soul. Here mathematics, medicine, geography, and philosophy flourished together, and it must have seemed to those who walked its corridors that no knowledge could ever truly be lost so long as this great house of learning endured. Yet the wonders of this world stretched far beyond the temples and the library. Lift your eyes to the plateau of Giza, where the Great Pyramid rises against the sky, a mountain made by human will. Even in its age, it stood as a marvel beyond comprehension, millions of stone blocks fitted together with a precision that still confounds us. Its sides aligned to the cardinal points with an accuracy that speaks of a mastery we struggle to explain. Beside it crouches the Sphinx, silent and eternal, its weathered face gazing toward the rising sun as it has for uncounted ages, guarding secrets it will not tell. These were not random monuments but expressions of a civilization that measured the heavens and mirrored them upon the earth, a people for whom the stars were not distant lights but sacred guides. And this was the miracle of the Nile itself, a thin ribbon of green winding through an endless ocean of sand, giving birth to one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known. Each year the river rose and flooded, renewing the soil, renewing life, teaching the Egyptians that death and rebirth were woven into the very rhythm of nature. From this cycle they drew their deepest beliefs, and into their sacred astronomy they poured their observations of the sun, the moon, and the wheeling constellations. Their temples were aligned to celestial events, their calendars tuned to the heavens, their architecture built to capture the light of particular stars on particular sacred days. Nothing was accidental. Everything pointed upward, outward, inward, toward the great harmony they believed governed all things. At the center of this radiant world stood the priesthood, the keepers of the flame. They were far more than performers of ritual. They were the guardians of knowledge, the astronomers and healers, the mathematicians and philosophers, the ones entrusted with the deepest teachings of their tradition. Through them the sacred wisdom was preserved, passed carefully from master to initiate across generations, spoken only to those deemed ready to receive it. This was the forgotten world that would one day inspire countless philosophers and mystics who came after a civilization that dared to seek the divine and believed that the universe itself could be read like a sacred text. Yet this radiant world would not last forever. Slowly, inevitably, the light of ancient wisdom began to fade. The fading did not happen in a single moment. There was no sudden catastrophe, no thunderclap that announced the end of an age. Instead, the decline came the way twilight comes to a great valley, so gradually that those living through it scarcely noticed the shadows lengthening around them. Century by century, the certainties that had once seemed eternal began to loosen. The priesthood, which had stood for thousands of years as the unbroken spine of Egyptian wisdom, slowly began to weaken. The old rigor of training softened. The chains of transmission, once passed with such care from master to initiate, began to fray at their weakest links. Fewer were chosen, fewer were ready, and with each generation that received a little less than the one before, something precious drained quietly out of the world. Egypt herself, that timeless land along the Nile, could not remain forever untouched by the ambitions of others. Foreign empires came, drawn by her wealth, her grain, her legend. The Assyrians came, and the Persians after them. Then came the Greeks beneath the banner of Alexander, and finally the vast machinery of Rome. Each conqueror admired Egypt, and each, in admiring her, reshaped her in his own image. The temples still stood, the rituals still whispered through the halls, but the living center of power had shifted elsewhere. A civilization that had once dictated the rhythm of the ancient world now moved to rhythms set by distant capitals. The priests who remained found themselves guarding traditions that fewer and fewer people around them understood, or even cared to understand. And then came the losses that could never be undone. In the great city of Alexandria, where the wisdom of Egypt had married the philosophy of Greece, there had risen a library unlike anything the world had known, a gathering place for the accumulated knowledge of civilizations, scroll upon scroll, mind upon mind. It was meant to hold the memory of humanity itself. Yet fire and conquest, neglect, and the slow cruelty of changing times wore it away until it was gone. We still speak of its destruction with a kind of grief, because we sense what it truly meant. It was not merely a building that burned. It was countless voices silenced, countless discoveries erased, countless answers to questions we have since had to ask all over again. When the Library of Alexandria vanished, humanity did not simply lose books. It lost pieces of itself. The mystery schools, too, began their long disappearance. These sacred institutions, which had once welcomed the worthy into chambers of profound initiation, could not survive in a world that no longer made room for them. As new faiths rose and old ones were forbidden, as political powers grew suspicious of secret knowledge they could not control, the schools withdrew deeper into silence. The temples that had housed them fell quiet. Their courtyards, once filled with the movement of robed initiates and the low murmur of sacred instruction, emptied out beneath the desert sun. Sand crept across their thresholds. Roofs collapsed. The great columns that had witnessed generations of seekers now stood as lonely monuments to a purpose the world had forgotten. What had been a living tradition became a ruin, and ruins tell only a fraction of the story they once contained. The sacred texts suffered the same fate. Scrolls were burned, buried, or simply left to crumble in forgotten rooms. Teachings that had been carried in the memory of initiates died with them when there was no one left prepared to receive what they carried. Knowledge that had been spoken aloud for centuries, from one trusted voice to another, dissolved into a silence that no one could reverse. What remained was scattered, broken, and dispersed like seeds thrown to the wind, landing far from the gardens that had grown them. And yet, remarkably, not everything was lost. Fragments survived. They endured in the hieroglyphs carved upon temple walls, waiting patiently through the long centuries for someone to learn to read them again. They endured in the sacred architecture itself, in the proportions and alignments that still whispered of a deeper design. They lived on in the myths that were told and retold, their true meanings half hidden beneath the surface of the story. They survived in symbols whose power outlasted the memory of their origin, and in secret traditions carried quietly through the ages by those who refused to let them die completely. But here we arrive at the heart of the matter, the true conflict of this entire story. For the enemy in this tale is not a tyrant, not a single villain who set out to destroy the wisdom of Egypt. The antagonist wears no face and speaks no name. It is something far more relentless and far more familiar. It is the destruction of knowledge itself. It is historical oblivion, that vast, silent tide that pulls the achievements of the past beneath its surface until they disappear from view. It is the loss of symbolic language, the slow erosion of our ability to understand the sacred meanings our ancestors once read as easily as we read words upon a page. It is the endless turning of religious and political transformations, each one reshaping or discarding what came before. And beneath all of these lies something even deeper. Humanity's own tendency to forget its intellectual and spiritual heritage, to let go of hard-won understanding simply because the effort to remember grows too heavy. This, in the end, is the deepest conflict of alone that has never truly been a struggle between empires or armies. It is the eternal tension between remembering and forgetting, between the light of preserved wisdom and the darkness of oblivion that presses in against it. Every civilization stands upon this fragile line, and Egypt was no exception. So much had already slipped away. So much seemed destined to be lost forever. And so a question began to form across the long centuries. Would anyone ever gather these scattered fragments again and lift them back into the light before they vanished completely? And so, centuries after the temples fell silent, one man set out to reassemble the scattered pieces of a wisdom the world had nearly lost. And so when Manly Palmer Hall opened those long-guarded doors, what he found was not a collection of dead secrets, but a living philosophy that had waited patiently in the shadows of history. Let us walk through it now, slowly, the way an initiate might have once walked through the torchlit corridors of a temple, each chamber revealing a little more of a truth too vast to be spoken all at once. Begin with the Egyptian mysteries themselves, for this is where the journey truly starts. To the Egyptians, the world was not a random arrangement of things, but a great tapestry of meaning, and every sacred symbol was a thread woven into that design. Consider the Eye of Horus, that watchful emblem gazing out from tomb walls and amulets across the centuries. It was far more than protection against misfortune. It spoke of wholeness restored after loss, of sight regained after darkness, of a divine order that could be broken and yet made whole again. And beside it stood the Ankh, the looped cross carried in the hands of gods and pharaohs, a liketh key of life itself, the promise that existence did not end at the threshold of death, but passed through it into something greater. Then there was Ma'at, perhaps the most quietly profound of them all. She was truth, she was balance, she was the cosmic harmony upon which the entire universe was said to rest. When a soul stood before the scales in the hall of judgment, its heart was weighed against her single feather, not against gold, not against deeds of conquest, but against truth. Imagine what it meant to build an entire civilization upon that idea that the ultimate measure of a life was its harmony with the order of all things, and around these principles moved the great myths, the story of Osiris betrayed and dismembered, of Isis wandering the earth to gather the pieces of the one she loved, of Horus rising to reclaim what had been lost. These were not simply tales told to children. They were maps of the human soul, death and grief and resurrection, the eternal cycle of falling apart and being made whole once more. From these mysteries we descend into something more silent, more precise, the sacred geometry hidden within stone. For the Egyptians did not separate the spiritual from the mathematical. To them, number was sacred, and proportion was prayer. Stand once more before the Great Pyramid of Giza, and consider that its dimensions echo measurements of the earth itself, that its angles and ratios seem to whisper of a knowledge far more advanced than we might expect from a people so ancient. Within its design, and within the design of temples across the land, scholars have traced the golden ratio, that mysterious proportion found in the spiral of a shell, the branching of a tree, the very structure of the human body. The Egyptians built it into their sacred spaces deliberately, so that to enter a temple was to step inside a living equation, a place where cosmic measurement and divine beauty became one. Their architecture was not merely shelter for worship. It was itself an act of worship, a way of aligning the earthly with the eternal, the human hand with the harmony of the stars. And so we come to the heart of it all, the teachings of the mystery schools, the hidden education that gave these symbols their meaning. Here knowledge was not given freely, it was earned. The seeker who wished to understand had first to undergo initiation, a long and demanding path that tested body, mind, and spirit alike. There was purification, the shedding of the old self, the cleansing of thought and desire. There were trials in darkness meant to confront the initiate with their deepest fears. And at the center of these teachings stood a single luminous idea, the immortality of the soul. The mystery schools taught that death was not an ending but a passage, that the true self could not perish, that within every human being lay a spark of the divine waiting to awaken. To pass through initiation was to experience a kind of rebirth, to die symbolically to the person one had been, and to rise transformed, remade, born again into a deeper understanding of existence. This was the great secret they guarded, that a human being could be more than they appeared, that the soul could be transfigured, lifted, made radiant. Yet even this was not the whole. For flowing through and beyond the Egyptian mysteries ran a current of universal wisdom, one that would carry these ideas far past the banks of the Nile. At its source stood a shadowy figure known as Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes, the thrice great, part god, part sage, part legend, said to be the author of a body of teachings that would come to be called Hermetic philosophy. To him was attributed the Emerald Tablet, that short and cryptic text containing the famous saying that as it is above, so it is below, that the great and the small mirror one another, that the cosmos and the human soul are woven of the same design. From this stream would rise the tree of life, the symbolic ladder of ascending realities. From it would come alchemy, so often mistaken for a foolish hunt for gold, when its true aim was the transformation of the soul itself, the turning of the base and heavy into something pure and shining. And over all of it glowed solar symbolism, the sun as the emblem of the divine light within, the source that gives life and asks always to be sought. And here is the revelation toward which all of this has been quietly moving. These teachings, the eye and the ankh, the pyramid and the golden proportion, the initiation and the immortal soul, the emerald tablet and the tree of life are not scattered, unrelated fragments, curiosities gathered from a lost age. They are threads of a single tapestry. Together they form one interconnected philosophy, a unified vision concerning humanity, consciousness, and the very structure of the universe. Beneath the many symbols lies one truth, spoken in 100 different voices. But this wisdom did not die with Egypt. It traveled across the ages, quietly shaping the minds of civilizations to come. Follow that thread now, out of Egypt and into the wider world, and you begin to see how far this hidden river ran. Long before the temples fell silent, young seekers from distant shores crossed the sea to sit at the feet of Egyptian priests. Among them was Pythagoras, who, according to the old accounts, spent more than 20 years among the initiates of the Nile, learning their mathematics, their music, their sacred geometry, and their reverence for number as the language of the divine. When he returned to the Greek world and founded his own brotherhood at Croton, he brought with him something older than Greece itself. His teaching that the cosmos was built upon harmony and proportion, that the soul was immortal and passed through many lives, that silence and purification were the gateways to knowledge. These were not born in an afternoon of Greek sunlight. They were echoes of the initiation chambers carried west in the memory of a single devoted man. And Pythagoras was not alone. Plato, the towering mind of the ancient world, is said to have journeyed to Egypt as well, drinking from the same deep well. In his dialogues we hear the priests of Sais gently reminding a Greek visitor that his people were but children, forgetful of the vast ages of the past. Plato's vision of eternal forms, of a reality more real than the shifting world of the senses, of the soul's descent and its long remembering, all of it carries the fragrance of the mystery schools. Through Plato, the hidden wisdom of Egypt entered the bloodstream of Western thought, and there it would pulse quietly for 2,000 years, surfacing again and again wherever a mind turned inward toward the eternal. From Greece the current flowed onward, changing its shape but never its essence. In the crowded, luminous streets of Alexandria, where Egyptian, Greek, and Eastern minds met and mingled, there arose the teachings we now call Hermeticism, attributed to that half-divine figure Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great, who is himself a marriage of Egyptian Thoth and Greek Hermes. The Hermetic writings spoke of a living universe, of correspondences between the heavens and the earth, of the human being as a small cosmos mirroring the Great One. Beside them grew the Gnostic schools, seekers who believed that salvation came not through belief alone but through gnosis, through direct, transforming knowledge of the divine spark hidden within. And woven through the same centuries came the streams of Jewish Kabbalah, with its tree of life, its sacred letters, its patient contemplation of the hidden architecture of creation. Different names, different tongues, different communities, yet beneath them all, the same ancient conviction that the visible world is a veil, and that wisdom means learning to see what lies behind it. Nor did the river stop there. It ran underground through the long medieval centuries and rose again in the work of the alchemists, those strange and patient laborers bent over their furnaces. To the careless eye they sought only to turn lead into gold, but to the initiated their true work was the transformation of the soul, the refining of the base human self into something pure and luminous, very lesson the Egyptian temples had taught beneath the sign of the sun. And when the alchemical tradition matured, it gave rise to fellowships that carried the old symbols into new halls. The Rosicrucians spoke in riddles of a hidden brotherhood guarding ancient secrets. The Freemasons raised their lodges upon the imagery of the temple, the pillar, the geometer's compass, the all-seeing eye, and the pyramid Egyptian to their very foundations. Whether or not any unbroken line connected them to the priests of Karnak, the imagination that shaped them was unmistakably Egyptian, reaching back across the millennia for a language grand enough to speak of the soul's ascent. Then came the Renaissance, when scholars rediscovered the Hermetic texts and read them as revelations, believing they had found the wisdom of a sage older than Moses. That rediscovery lit a fire in the European mind, feeding its art, its philosophy, its architecture, its yearning to unite the human and the divine, and the fire did not go out with the coming of the modern age. In the 20th century, Carl Jung gazed into the dreams and myths of humanity and found there the same eternal symbols the Egyptians had carved in stone archetypes rising from a collective depth we all share. The process he called individuation, the long journey toward wholeness and the integration of the self, is, in its own careful language, another retelling of the ancient path of initiation, the death of the old self, the descent, the rebirth into a greater life. Look closely now, and you will find these symbols everywhere in the world we have built. They stand in the columns of our government buildings and the facades of our banks. They hide in the geometry of monuments and the quiet order of museums. They appear on our currency, in the pages of our literature, in the great myths that flicker across the screens of our cinemas, in the emblems of society still devoted to the search for meaning. The eye within the triangle, the obelisk against the sky, the winged disk, the endless circle we pass them daily, most of us never pausing to wonder where they came from or what they were once meant to awaken. They have become so familiar that they have grown invisible, wisdom worn smooth by time until it looks like mere decoration. And so we arrive at the question that lingers like incense in an empty temple. If these symbols still surround us, still shape the spaces we live in and the stories we tell, then perhaps the wisdom of ancient Egypt was never truly buried at all. Perhaps it is hidden not in some sealed vault beneath the sand, but in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of our world, waiting patiently for those who still remember how to read it. Which brings us back to the mystery we began with. Why did this wisdom seem to vanish, and was it ever truly lost at all? To answer that question, we must return not to the sands of Egypt, but to the nature of the wisdom itself, to the peculiar way it was meant to be received. For the truth is that this knowledge was never intended to be read the way we read a headline or scroll through a page. It was meant to be earned. In the temples of Karnak and Luxor, in the shadowed halls of Memphis and Heliopolis, one did not simply walk in and ask to be taught the secrets of the soul. The path of initiation stretched across years, sometimes across an entire lifetime, demanding patience, discipline, and a transformation of the self so complete that the person who emerged was scarcely the same as the one who entered. Consider what that meant. A candidate might spend years in silence before a single deeper teaching was offered. There were trials of the body and trials of the spirit, long fasts and long vigils, tests of fear and tests of faith. The teachings of immortality, of rebirth, of the hidden architecture of the cosmos were not handed out freely, because the priests believed that wisdom given to the unprepared was not a gift but a danger. Knowledge to them was like fire. In trained hands it could illuminate, in careless ones it could destroy, and so from the very beginning this wisdom carried within it the seed of its own disappearance. A tradition that guards itself so jealously, that speaks only to the devoted few, is always one generation away from silence. All it takes is for that thread of teacher and student to be broken once, and what took centuries to build can slip beyond recovery. But there was a second reason the wisdom grew hidden, subtler than the first. The Egyptians did not think in the plain literal language we favor today. They thought in symbols. When they wished to speak of resurrection, they did not write an essay, they carved the story of Osiris, dismembered and made whole again. When they wished to speak of the soul's watchful, all-seeing awareness, they gave us the eye of Horus. The ankh, the scarab, the winged disk, the pyramid rising toward a single point was a vessel, a container for meaning far larger than the shape itself. To those who had been initiated, these images spoke volumes. They were a language of the invisible, a way of pointing toward truths too vast for ordinary words. But a symbol is only as alive as the mind that knows how to read it. Strip away the key, and the symbol falls silent. The carving remains beautiful, but it no longer speaks. And this, perhaps more than fire or conquest, is how the wisdom began to fade, not because the images were destroyed, but because the ability to understand them slowly slipped away. Then came the weight of history itself. Egypt, for all its endurance, was not immune to the tides of empire. Foreign powers arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans, each bringing their own gods, their own tongues, their own ways of governing the living and honoring the dead. The old priesthood, which had guarded the temples for thousands of years, found its authority eroded, its resources withdrawn, its sacred rhythms interrupted. When the institutions that protect knowledge are dismantled, the knowledge does not simply relocate, it scatters. The chain of initiation, already fragile, began to fray under the pressure of political upheaval. Temples that had once echoed with hymns before dawn fell quiet. The men and women who carried the living memory of the mysteries grew old, and fewer stood ready to take their place. And with the empires came new faiths, new visions of the divine that reshaped the old world in their image. As religious transitions swept across the ancient landscape, the older traditions were not always destroyed outright. Often they were transformed, absorbed, reinterpreted, or quietly set aside as relics of a vanished age. What had once been sacred became suspect. What had once been a path to enlightenment was recast as superstition. The symbols endured, but their meanings were rewritten or forgotten, layered over by newer stories until the original voice beneath grew faint. And when the great libraries disappeared, when the shelves of Alexandria and countless smaller archives were scattered, burned, or simply left to crumble, the written record that might have preserved the key was erased. What survived came down to us in fragments. A carving here, a myth there, a ritual half-remembered, a symbol whose meaning had drifted like a boat cut loose from its mooring. So we return at last to the mystery we began with, and to a conclusion that is quieter and stranger than we might have expected. We imagine the Great Concealment as an act of deliberate hiding, priests sealing scrolls in secret chambers, guarding their treasures against the world, and there is truth in that image. But perhaps the deepest secret was never hidden by the priests at all. Perhaps it became hidden for a far more human reason. It became hidden because we, over the long centuries, slowly forgot how to read the language of symbols. The teachings did not vanish behind a locked door. They dissolved into a tongue we stopped speaking. The wisdom remained written across temple walls and woven through ancient myths, but the eyes that once understood it closed one by one, until what had been a living voice became to us only silent stone. And yet in this is the gentle miracle at the heart of it all: knowledge was never completely lost. That is the thing we must hold on to. It did not die, it simply changed the way it revealed itself. It slipped from the spoken teaching into the carved symbol, from the temple into the myth, from the myth into the quiet corners of philosophy and art and architecture that carried it forward without ever announcing its name. Wisdom, it seems, is far more patient than the empires that tried to bury it. It waits, it endures, it hides in plain sight, wearing whatever disguise the age requires until someone is ready to look again. And if that language could be relearned, we might discover that Egypt's greatest gift is still present all around us. Look around you, truly look, and you begin to notice something quietly astonishing. Egypt never really left us. Its language of forms is everywhere, hiding in the ordinary landscape of modern life, waiting for eyes that remember how to see. Walk through the heart of any great city, and you will find it standing in the architecture of power itself. The columns, the pediments, the deliberate geometry of institutions that wish to borrow the authority of the eternal. Government buildings rise with the solemn proportions first perfected along the Nile. Obelisks, carved by Egyptian hands or raised in imitation of them, stand in the public squares of Rome and Paris, of London and Washington, pointing skyward exactly as they did when they marked the thresholds of temples. We pass them daily, we rarely ask what they were meant to say. Step into a museum and the presence deepens. Behind glass, the funerary masks and painted coffins gaze out at us with a stillness that has outlasted every civilization that came after them. The monuments, the sarcophagi, the fragments of temple walls, these are not merely relics of a dead world. They are a message that refused to decay, patiently repeating itself across the centuries to anyone willing to stand and listen. And it is not only in the halls of history that Egypt endures. Look at religious art and you will find the winged forms, the solar discs, the serene frontal gaze that shaped how sacred figures would be portrayed for thousands of years. The visual grammar of the holy was written, in no small part, in the temples of the Nile. But the influence runs deeper than stone and pigment. It lives in the very proportions we still call beautiful. Sacred geometry, golden ratio, the harmonies of circle and square, the mathematics that the initiates believed reflected the structure of the cosmos itself, continues to guide the hands of architects and artists who may never have heard the names of those who first discovered it. It appears in the layout of cathedrals and the framing of paintings, in the quiet order that makes a space feel somehow right, and in our own restless age the old symbols surface in the most unexpected places. Look at the currency in your pocket, and you may find the pyramid crowned with a radiant eye, an emblem carried out of Egypt through mystery school and secret society into the everyday commerce of the modern world. Look at corporate logos, at the eyes and pyramids and rising suns that companies choose without always knowing why, drawn, perhaps, to the same instinct that made those forms feel powerful 3,000 years ago. Open a great work of literature and Egypt is there, in the themes of death and rebirth, of hidden knowledge and the descent into the underworld of the self. Sit in a darkened cinema and watch how film after film returns to the tomb, the curse, the ancient secret guarded by symbol stories that keep circling back to the same buried fascination, as though our culture cannot stop dreaming of the place where wisdom was first hidden. And in the quiet gatherings of modern esoteric organizations, the fraternities and orders that still trace their lineage, real or imagined, to the initiates of the Nilith-old rituals of purification and ascent are enacted once more, keeping alive the belief that the human being can be transformed, step by step, into something wiser and more whole. So the legacy of ancient Egypt is not a thing sealed behind museum glass. It is not merely historical, a chapter closed and catalogued. It is living. It is woven into the fabric of the world we move through every day, into our buildings and our money, our stories and our images, our longing for meaning and our search for something larger than ourselves. It shaped the philosophers of Greece and the mystics of the desert, and it shapes still the quiet assumptions we carry about what is sacred and what is true. The river of that wisdom did not dry up. It went underground, and it is flowing beneath us yet. And here, at the end of the long journey, we arrive at the heart of the matter, the single insight toward which all of it has been pointing. For all the temples and treasures, all the geometry and gold, the greatest gift Egypt gave to the world was never an object at all. It was an idea, the idea that true wisdom does not begin in a library or a laboratory, in conquest or in commerce. It begins within. It begins the moment a human being turns to look, honestly and without flinching, at the mystery of their own existence. Every ceremony of initiation, every trial in the darkness of the inner chamber, every symbol carved into the temple wall was designed to lead the seeker toward a single, transforming recognition that the answers they sought outside were only reflections of what waited to be awakened inside. That is why, as the secret teachings of all ages so patiently suggests, every ancient symbol is ultimately a mirror. The eye, the ankh, the pyramid, the serpent, the sun, they were never meant only to be admired. They were meant to be understood, and in understanding them, to understand oneself. Each one points not outward toward some distant secret, but inward, toward the slow and sacred transformation of the individual who dares to gaze into it. The whole vast architecture of Egyptian mystery was, in the end, a single instruction. Know yourself, and in knowing yourself, know the cosmos. And so we are left, as every initiate was left, with the question that no monument can answer for us. Did Egypt truly preserve a profound spiritual science, a genuine understanding of consciousness and the universe that echoes down to us still? Or was it a magnificent mythology, a symbolic language for the deepest longings of the human heart? Perhaps the distinction matters less than we imagine, for whether science or symbol, the invitation is the same, and it is extended to each of us. And so the journey turns inward, where the oldest wisdom still waits to be remembered.